أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والمؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر ويقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة ويطيعون الله ورسوله أولئك سيرحمهم الله إن الله عزيز حكيم وعد الله المؤمنين والمؤمنات جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها ومساكن طيبة في جنات عدن ورضوان من الله أكبر ذلك هو الفوز العظيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. The translation of the verses which I recited, which are from chapter 9, Surah At-Tawbah, verses number 71 and 72. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the believing men and women are supporters of one another. They enjoin what is good, they forbid what is wrong, they establish the prayer, they give zakat, and they obey Allah and His Messenger. Those are the ones upon whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will shower His mercy. Indeed, Allah is almighty and wise. Allah promises the believing men and women gardens under which rivers flow, forever therein, and pure dwellings in the gardens of Eden. But greater than all of that is the good pleasure from Allah, and that is the great victory. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here as part of this National Zakat Foundation 5th year anniversary event. It's an event that has been a long time in the planning, and it's fantastic that you can all be here to share in this with us today. There are sort of three purposes really of this event. Number one is to celebrate the past and to reflect upon the past, to assess where we are today, number two, and thirdly, vision for the future. And our topic, the power of zakat in transforming our community, and in particular our speakers this evening, have been chosen to help us navigate this territory. The National Zakat Foundation was inspired by very shocking and tragic stories of poverty in the UK, specifically amongst Muslim women, and specifically in Birmingham. So there are one or two stories, quite tragic stories of homelessness, and unfortunately in one case eventual suicide of a lady who had gone through really quite horrific circumstances. And it was a reflection upon how we could possibly have allowed such a situation to occur that inspired the National Zakat Foundation to be born. And so the Ramadan 2011 was the first time that effectively there was a public launch. And at that time, the pitch, if you like, or the appeal to the community was to support National Zakat Foundation to establish the first supported housing project for homeless Muslim women who are really in the depths of their vulnerability and destitution, so that there would be a safe space where they could access support. Since then, we have launched 4 such projects, one in London, one in Birmingham, one in Manchester for homeless Muslim women, and we've also launched recently one in London for young male ex-offenders. And Davina referred to the issue of reoffending and prison leavers, and it really is a critical need that we've started to try and address. We've also supported outside of these projects 3,500 eligible zakat recipients from around the country. So we've been dealing with applications and referrals from all over the country and from a very big range of sources of referrals, both within the community and outside of the community. In order to do this, we've distributed close to £4 million of zakat since inception, and that £4 million of zakat has come from around 35,000 zakat payments and donations. Our team now, in which we've been recently investing quite heavily, numbers just over 20 full and part-time staff. We have offices in Wembley, and we are hopefully going to soon be moving further into central London. We have also significantly in 2013 launched National Zakat Foundation in both Canada and Australia. And alhamdulillah, there's been similar stories of growth and success in both those two countries. And imminently this year, which is maybe something we can touch on in more detail later on, we're hoping to actually establish a global zakat entity, not only to house these existing projects or these existing institutions in the various countries, but also to really grow and develop the global zakat agenda. Because if the zakat situation is to be assessed not only here but even globally, it is arguable that really this pillar is in a bit of a crisis. And I think if I'm just to encapsulate in a line, what we're trying to do is that we're trying to, I suppose, patch up, repair, re-erect, and then uphold this pillar of zakat within our community, but increasingly now in the world. With that, I will introduce Shaykh Abdal Hakim. Shaykh Abdal Hakim was educated at Cambridge, Al-Azhar and London universities. He is currently the Shaykh Zayed Lecturer of Islamic Studies in the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge University and Director of Studies in Theology at Wolfson College. He has published and contributed to numerous academic works on Islam, including as Director of the Sunnah Project, and is a leading figure in interfaith activity. He is well known as a contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day. Shaykh Abdal Hakim, as I mentioned, is the founder and dean of Cambridge Muslim College, which we've just heard about. But on a personal note, I first met Shaykh Abdal Hakim in 2002 as a first-year undergraduate at Cambridge, and ever since he has been a huge inspiration for me. His ability to articulate the beauty of our faith, especially in the context of the challenges that we face, is in my view unparalleled. And even though we have met only on a few occasions since I graduated just over a decade ago, I have regularly looked him up on YouTube for inspiration and to kind of keep me going. So it's my huge personal... you're a YouTube hit, by the way, Sheikh. So it's my huge personal honor and privilege to invite Shaykh Abdal Hakim to address us this evening on the topic of the power of zakat in transforming our community.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I thought I'd say a few words about the way the zakat might function creatively and successfully in the rather peculiar context of the 21st century financial system. Like most Islamic questions, this is a very topical kind of question. One of the most familiar features, I guess, of Islam is its resolute stability, even immobility. When you think about it, which other world religion has maintained not just core doctrines, but the details of its practice intact, really intact from the time of its foundation? So like the prayer, like Ramadan, and like the Hajj, the pillar of zakat seems very strongly to partake of the Shariah's timelessness. These are rules which are simply not made to be broken. And yet, the zakat, while required to remain faithful to the Blessed Founder's inaugural vision, is a bit different to the other pillars. If the prayer is about worshipping God, and the fast about self-denial, and the Hajj about our reconnection with our sacred past and our sacred centre, the pillar of zakat concerns our connection to society in its indispensable financial dimension. Religion, a term which some of you will know springs from a Latin word meaning to bind or to connect, doesn't just bind us to heaven but to our fellow men. Religion is eminently a social thing. And because the world around us has changed in such extreme and disorienting ways, not least in the way it recycles our wealth, this pillar of Islam finds itself confronted, I think, by greater challenges than those which currently face our other fundamental obligations. There is a kind of crisis, and Iqbal has already alluded to that. Putting that rather differently, one could say that the zakat has an inward and also an outward-looking, extroverted dimension. Inwardly, it has the evident effect of purging us and purifying us of elements of our greed, our avarice, and our indifference to other human beings. It is cathartic, a palpable, sometimes even painful tithe, which renders the remainder of our worldly goods spiritually and morally available to us. It's a healing of our personal inner economies, a kind of fiscal hijama. But as well as conferring this blessing, the zakat connects us to all other human beings to whom we are tied through our financial and legal dealings. The Sharia regulates and purifies those dealings in a myriad other ways. But the foundation of our financial social interactivity is to be this levy on our wealth. So important is economic justice to the Qur'an's vision of society that this social pillar of the religion is not about what you might expect, family or neighbor or jihad, but relates to how money is stored, taxed and exchanged. Of course, it is in no sense an alternative to other forms of social action. The rules of zakat already incorporate principles of preferring family, neighbor and those who risk their lives in the defense of the community. Still, the principle remains. Zakat is our third pillar and not, for instance, Silat Rahim, family piety. So it seems that the whole social vision of a believing and just Muslim society is characteristically focused on economic justice. As the Holy Prophet once remarked, "Were poverty to be a man, I would slay him." And some of the very first verses of the scripture to be revealed were dire warnings against avarice and the neglect of the financial well-being of the disadvantaged sections of Meccan society. Your Lord enjoins justice, says the book. And without economic justice, there can in fact be little justice of any kind. Hence, one might surmise the titanic importance of this cardinal duty of our religion. The Muslims are very characteristically a people who are to value economic fairness. Now, way back in medieval times, the zakat institution, which often supported and was in turn supported by a vast infrastructure of waqf endowments across the huge Islamic world, contributed immensely to the alleviation of poverty and other kinds of want. From today's perspective, those societies were nonetheless characterized by limited levels of sophistication. Although medieval Islam did invent some complex financial systems, remember that words like check and tariff are actually of Arabic origin. The theory of classical zakat referred to a society infinitely less complex and centrally managed than our own world of runaway turbo-capitalism. The jurists today increasingly furrow their brows at the proliferation of complex and often frankly parasitic financial instruments, long-short funds, macros, futures, derivatives, and real estate investment trusts. Whole corporations, not far from where I'm speaking, are dedicated exclusively to trading financial products which bet on currency or commodity movements at various points in the unstable future. Computers trade on rapid market shifts in intervals of 1/1000th of a second. And most fundamentally of all, money itself has become an abstraction whose value and availability are defined by the fiat of central banks. Which of the thousands of new forms of money is liable to which forms of zakat is a question which I leave in the capable hands of the National Zakat Foundation. But the fiqh of Sharia-compliant operation in the new financial hall of mirrors is not my concern in my little talk. Instead, I want to explore the way in which the principle of zakat itself, in its broad and hopefully timeless architecture, might bring a significant new force to bear in the odd and alarmingly unstable world of modern casino capitalism. Let's reflect for a few moments on the current oddness of the global economy. In its volatility and strangeness, it seems to mirror so many other modern sources of worry and uncertainty, such as climate change, terrorism, the flux in social forms and relationships, religious confusion, and the domination of global culture by powerful media corporations. In some ways, it's connected to all of these other headaches. But its inherent strangeness makes it, I think, in a class of its own. This oddity and the precariousness which it veils is not sufficiently known to the general public. In little more than a generation, financial laws and processes which underpinned the world for centuries have been abolished or allowed to mutate very strangely. vast bubbles grow, thanks to 1,000 new forms of credit, and credit upon credit. But the British reader and viewer reads the financial columns and assumes that despite all this commotion, business is basically as usual. But it isn't. Why are we so ignorant in an age of mass communication when in a few effortless clicks we can access the deregulated stock exchange and even trade shares for ourselves? When the local bank manager is unnecessary because we can operate our own accounts online and create and structure our own assets and borrowing. Thanks to the internet revolution, we can step right inside the financial institutions. Endless leaks even allow us to read private emails to top tax consultants at Marek Fonseca. The system seems reassuringly pretty transparent, and yet we do not see the fire in the forest thanks to all the young trees. The reason is that the information revolution has coincided with a mushrooming of what Benjamin de Motte calls junk politics. This is the politics of the zippy soundbite, indispensable to us in our world of WhatsApp and texting. We need a quicker and quicker thought from the politicians. A considered parliamentary speech on justice is really nobody's news. A leaked killer quote is. So are the vulgar secrets of a politician's private life. And the increasing HD quality of visual media directs our senses to the two-dimensional. Do people think more of Boris Johnson's investment on the Jubilee line, or do they remember him more for his hairstyle and his alarming unsteadiness on a bicycle? Like modern art, politics increasingly finds itself accessible when it replaces truth with style. What is cool is what is new and interesting. Junk politics cannot direct us to reflect in a measured way on social inequities or the real reasons for Palestinian anger or for climate change. Like us, the politicians do not want to look long into the face of such deep issues. Instead, they know our indulgent, distracted habits, our attention spans are short and shortening. So successful junk politicians make everything personal. The Obama presidency was a case in point. What was really new about his policies? Did he actually close Guantanamo, tackle income disparity or unemployment? And Tony Blair inaugurated the same age for ourselves. What he stood for was a susurration of newly spun emotive and faux sincere soundbites measured to the current atmosphere. His successors, despite, I think, the ongoing older British dislike of charismatic politicians, have really not been much better. They know that most of us glance only at headlines and images and need emotional reassurance and fear analysis. The main argument against Sadiq Khan was not policy-related at all, but comprised a vague and weak insinuation about alleged Islamist connections. This, sadly, is the new normal in British politics. De Motte says that in this novel world of junk politics, there is zero interruption in the processes and practices that strengthen existing interlocking systems of socio-economic advantage. It miniaturizes, he says, large, complex problems at home while maximizing threats from abroad. It's also given to abrupt, unexplained reversals of its own public stances. So we have, on the world stage, an accelerating Islamophobia, riding on our fears about terrorism, allowing the British state to adopt an increasingly illiberal and inquisitorial stance towards Muslim citizens, without there really being time to think calmly about the longer-term implications for social integration. And the income disparities continue to grow. Now that there is really no socialism, everyone who wishes to use his or her vote must choose parties who trade on our panic about the moment, rather than those with a long-term vision of equitable human flourishing. While we scan the headlines anxiously, the corporate structures distract us with news of natural disasters, celebrity divorces, and terrorist dirty bombs. In a culture immersed in profitable entertainment, news must be diverting, preferably as an erotic or a horror spectacle. It can no longer afford regularly to instruct or to reflect. So the global financial system, itself grounded in the illusion that it is trading with measures of real intrinsic value, is veiled by the illusion machine of the media networks. This is certainly one key reason for the volatility of the markets. Most equity and commodity fluctuations are caused by irrational herd impulses, or what is more politely called market sentiment, rather than by anything real. The FTSE is the plaything of politicians who abbreviate their feelings about Brexit. But nobody actually knows anything at all. What would really happen to markets if we left? Nobody knows. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek recently gave a lecture in London with the title The Buddhist Ethic and the Spirit of Global Capitalism. He reflected on the fact that the most common form of religious practice in the City of London is now Buddhism, often in quite radical forms. The bond traders on 16-hour shifts need to wind down and decompress, and hence mindfulness, Zen, or various holistic meditative therapies have become the spirituality of choice. The Wren churches, meanwhile, bustle with lunchtime concerts and parties of Chinese tourists, but evensong among the glass spires is rather sparsely attended. The reason? Theravada Buddhism holds that all is a void, nothing is intrinsic. Values, life, soul, self, the body, money, bonds, the NASDAQ, all are unreal, humming in a state of endless playful flux. Green figures dancing forever across a void. Sunyata. What more perfect model could there be for the modern numbers game? We borrow pounds that don't yet exist and then trade on their future movements. With the profits, we trade again. Money bursts from this cornucopia of consensual illusion. Everyone seems to gain, and there's plenty more paper, so who is going to speak out? Washington and London insiders are hardly oblivious to the dizzy precariousness of this situation. However, any last-minute escape from the jaws of a new credit crunch that would make 2008 look like a picnic would demand decisions that elected politicians, addicted as usual to the short-termism endemic in the election cycle, could not take without courting electoral annihilation. And yet, all of this may not go round and round forever. Ponder, if you will, the remarks made by Donald Trump only a few days ago. In an interview with CNBC, the Republican frontrunner staggered viewers by letting something slip. He speculated about a possible need to force holders of US debt to, as the jargon goes, take a haircut, rather as Greek savings account holders have done. They would lose maybe 10 or 15% of their bond balances in a sudden and irreversible raid by the Fed. This scary prophecy is not the kind of things politicians usually divulge or promise. The reaction in America of the establishment media, which is largely committed to the print money forever philosophy, was to hit the panic button. The Washington Post called the speech reckless. In effect, it continued, the US government would be in a state of default. The collapse of confidence in the world's banker of last resort, the Federal Reserve, and in the worth of Treasury bonds would cause a global economic meltdown, with a massive shift away from bonds into equities, hedge funds, property, and precious metals. The dollar would weaken as a global reserve currency, perhaps even to be replaced by the euro or even the renminbi. Even a 10% haircut would, it seems, precipitate this yawm al-hisab in the financial markets. 2008 and the 2000 dot-com bubble would be serene memories by comparison. The trouble is that everyone, even the Hillary, knows that the alternative is likely to be more apocalyptic still. Here is what Trump actually said. We're paying very low interest rates. What happens if that interest rate goes 2, 3, 4 points up? We don't have a country. If you look at the numbers, they're staggering. Trump, who comes from left field and is not a Beltway insider, has actually mentioned the unmentionable. Servicing the US national debt this year is projected to exceed $260 billion, all in interest, riba repayments, even with the historically bizarre nil interest rates effectively decreed by the Federal Reserve. What if rates creep up to their historic post-war average of 4.7%? Any resumption of these traditionally normal levels would result in the interest repayments jumping to over $1 trillion, more than a quarter of America's federal budget. What would happen if this happened? The White House would be forced to borrow more money to cope with this enhanced level of debt servicing, and a vicious circle would ensue, capsizing the entire American economy and therefore government within an estimated 5 years. Military spending, currently 54% of America's GDP, would need to be slashed, and that would slash the whole American empire. And this, remember, if rates only go up to their historical average. A return to the double-digit rates of the 1980s would pull the apocalypse lever much, much sooner. Here in the UK, we are just as exposed. On May the 12th, the Bank of England directors voted unanimously to maintain the base rate of 0.5%, the lowest for 3 centuries, a level which has been held now for an astonishing 7 years. At such levels, our 1.63 trillion national debt is just manageable. But even Mr. Carney has warned of an uplift in rates following a possible Brexit. This, or any entirely unforeseen black swan sort of event, could push rates back towards their historical norms. The national budget, already really cut by Osborne down to the bone, would have to take a further swinging hit, perhaps with a downlift of 1/3 or more. The NHS, state pensions, and many social services already struggling certainly could not survive in their present form. That's the scenario for the national debt. The implications of massive mortgage default among house owners and buy-to-let landlords would be even more calamitous. An unprecedented political and social emergency would be hard to avoid, all because of this return of rates of riba to historically quite normal average levels. It's almost universally agreed that, like a corpse, the economy has been blowing bubbles. Cheap money, quantitative easing, and a regulatory structure that, despite the 2008 disaster, remains permissive, have allowed debt to mushroom. All this during a period of so-called recovery, which by most traditional indices has not been much of a recovery at all. The so-called equilibrium rate of interest, in which investment and savings correspond with full employment in a moderately inflationary environment, is now extremely low, thanks to the fact that the rate of inflation is almost non-existent. The equilibrium rate is looking unprecedentedly faint and flat. Neo-Keynesians are talking of a radical and stubbornly persistent form of secular stagnation. Quite like that phrase, secular stagnation. The same neo-Keynesians argue that the economy needs more stimulus in the traditional Keynesian way of further credit injection. But again, the religion of economics is a broad church. Others, including pundits of the so-called Austrian school, have published a number of papers recently to defend the somewhat self-evident point that a surge in cheap money causes, rather than resolves, a financial crisis. These Austrian school economists have only one solution: raise interest rates. They're convinced that the world is experiencing real interest rates below zero, despite our low levels of inflation. Lending money helps to store it and push it around, but makes a loss, not a profit. Already, some European central banks are offering bonds with a negative interest rate, even before inflation is taken into account. So on this view, we need higher rates to re-establish the equilibrium rate so that investment and savings once more exist in some kind of coherent and balanced relationship. The ongoing boom and bust fairground ride of the new imperial capitalism is taking us to an unguessable destination. And we cannot tell at what point to get off. Are we looking at cycles or at a structural depression? Nobody can tell us. The theorists can't agree. The situation we find ourselves in is entirely without precedent. Whereas in pre-modern states, and certainly in the Islamic political model, central government's functions were limited essentially to matters of security and the regulation of the mint, the modern state has become a monster whose tentacles stretch into every horizon of the citizen's life. Our education, justice, health, and other key dimensions of our existence are subject to meticulous state regulation and control. And money itself, the key indicant of value, is valued and created by the state's central bank. Money does not come from mines in God's solid earth, but is pieces of paper whose value is determined by central policy, rooted in economic theories on which there is, as it turns out, no consensus at all. Here again, Islamic values insist on personal freedom. A private currency whose worth is essentially outside the power of central banks to determine is to be the essential measure of exchange in a Sharia system. Unlike, say, the Bitcoin, whose claimed libertarian advantages have not really outweighed the problem of its volatility, gold and silver, the naqdain, allow private individuals considerable freedom from manipulation by states and corporate interests. The naqdain also provide insurance against unexpected haircuts, levies, and other state-imposed interferences with personal wealth. And when the ATMs finally stop doling out cash, the naqdain will truly come into their own. All this perhaps seems to you to be of more relevance to Islamic banks than to Islamic charity, even though the two can really hardly be disentangled. But perhaps we can now begin to make the point that if we, as conscientious and believing human beings who abhor the relativism of modern values and the human suffering which results from living in our modern hall of illusions, we will find it tricky to create a fully Sharia-compliant banking system. It's true that Islamic banks represent a vastly preferable alternative to conventional usury finance, not only because they try to invest ethically, avoiding investment, say, in alcohol and other narcotics, but also because they tend to be comparatively well capitalized and to avoid some of the more esoteric and parasitic financial instruments which make banks vulnerable in times of sudden recession. During the 2008 crisis, the Islamic banks generally fared fairly well, although there were some embarrassing exceptions. However, the money in which they hold their Sharia-compliant deposits is not the naqdain, but euros and greenbacks. Hence, they are inextricably part of the global net of fiduciary money, and as such, they cannot really escape its volatility, or, if the whole system goes down, its collapse. This is not to say that the experiment has been bogus, as claimed by some purists. In our strange global environment, one is always looking for the least bad option. Sharia compliance these days is basically a matter of degree. Let us remember Islam's traditional realism. Still, let us also consider that the Islamic economic vision is not limited to the creation of banking services. As we mentioned a few minutes ago, the third pillar, which relates to justice, actually is not about banking at all. It is zakat, a statutory purgation of our fiscal bloodstream. So perhaps the creation of institutions such as the National Zakat Foundation, benefiting from London's stringent charity and financial regulatory environment, represent a more interesting area in which to develop our campaign to offer an ethical and also realistic alternative to the current destructive economic paradigm. Let's hold that thought for a while. Islamic banks often, unfortunately, recycle assets among wealthy investors. Much of the fancy London skyline is now the result of Middle Eastern and Malaysian speculation. The Olympic Village is one example. The makeover of Battersea Power Station is another. There is One Hyde Park, Harrods, Chelsea Barracks, and look just down the road at the Shard, which was partly financed by Sharia-compliant instruments. Walk through the dismal and depressed streets around it, as I've just done, and it's by no means clear that the ethical imperatives of Islamic banking have in practice delivered at ground level to the streets of Southwark. It may even be the case that the influx of Gulf money to the safe haven of the London property market has helped to drive up house prices in the capital with grave consequences for the poor. The Islamic banks tend to invest in Mayfair property portfolios, not in affordable housing. This is hardly very Islamic. A zakat initiative, however, would by definition make a difference to those streets. Let's consider for a moment how much tithable money is floating around in this city. Some is indeterminate, thanks to the shell within a shell tax avoidance stunts recently revealed in the Marat-Fonseca revelations, of which, incidentally, more is to come. London is home to more ultra-high net worth individuals than any other city in the world. This is a category of people with at least £20 million at their disposal over and above the price of the house where they live. There may be 5,000 of them here in London, and quite a few of them are Muslims, including, believe it or not, quite a few of those storied Russian oligarchs, friends or foes of Putin and his sprawling global political portfolio. The Sunday Times Rich List this year names over 15 Muslims, and the effects of their gilded lives are everywhere to be seen. Luxury clothes shops schedule culturally specific appointments for Gulf ladies. The most spiffy hotels, such as the Dorchester and the Savoy, provide female butlers, prayer rooms, and halal chefs. Super rich people like these account for an ever-growing share of global wealth. A recurrent feature of our age seems to be capital concentration in their hands. According to Forbes magazine, the world's 66 richest people own more than the poorest half of the Earth's population. and that number 66 is being slowly pressed downwards. At the opposite end of the spectrum, an increasing number of people are obliged to manage on the minimum wage or to work as unpaid interns. The middle classes are being squeezed as less healthcare is available for free and as they're obliged to support their children well into their 20s and even beyond. As Danny Dorling puts it in his book Inequality and the 1%, we are all being turned into service workers in a world that seems to exist for only a few individuals. London's ultra-high net worth scene is largely made up of foreign expatriates. Of these, it is not clear how many are being approached to discharge their zakat obligations, although some are visibly generous to secular charities. There is surely mileage in the idea that they should be called upon to support, say, anti-extremism initiatives in the Muslim community, far from the bungling of Whitehall or the provocations of the Prevent agenda. After all, the Gulf states, or most of them, are mainly responsible for the funding of global fundamentalism, the potash which fertilizes Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Why should they not also fund charities and mosques which try to challenge the extremists? As yet, they have not really begun to do this. They're a bit like Exxon, trying as hard as they can to avoid clearing up their own oil spillage. Their own petrodollars have supported global fundamentalism, so now let them spend some money on mainstream Islam. Unfortunately, many Middle Eastern expatriates in London appear resistant to the idea that if they fast in Ramadan and pray in the Dorchester Mosque, they are also equally liable to pay zakat. Salat rhymes with zakat. Those verses don't work well with any one of the pair. Their Islam is unbalanced. It is an Islam which doesn't rhyme. And the impact on their souls is quite evident in their faces. Take as a depressing reminder of this a recent Princeton University study of student responses to poverty and suffering. Students were shown pictures of alcoholics and homeless people while in an MRI scanner. So the students were in the scanner and then they were shown these images. The brains of students from wealthy backgrounds who did not need to work or take student loans tended to respond very distinctively, often showing activity in areas of the brain associated with disgust. The reaction to seeing the images was often indistinguishable from their reaction to images of piles of uncollected garbage. It seems that wealth and privilege tend not only to harden the heart, they can also rewire the brain. Zakat, therefore, presents itself as a moral and economic remedy of a radical kind. Income taxes have failed to limit the accelerating gulf between rich and poor. Social services and healthcare continue to be cut. Here, Revelation proposes a different type of solution. Zakat is effectively a net wealth tax. True, there are exemptions, one's own private home, for instance, but the £1 in every 40 annual tithe remains immensely promising. Just consider the amount which could be raised from Britain's Muslim millionaires. According to the Muslim Council of Britain, there are more than 10,000 of them, worth almost £4 billion. That's £100 million a year for charity right there. And what about the 14,000 Muslim-owned businesses in London? Apparently over a third of small to medium enterprises in some parts of London are now Muslim-owned. What is the zakat liability there? Already, according to the charity commissioners, Muslims are per capita the most generous charitable givers in the UK. A full operationalising of a national zakat system could build this substantially and even spectacularly higher. But zakat is not simply about charity. There is also sadaqah, which is different. Zakat has not only a charitable object, but a larger redistributive function. And this forms part of the wider philosophy intrinsic to Islam's social vision. While mercantile activity is encouraged and praised, the long-term accumulation of capital is obstructed by several Sharia principles. One of them is our system of inheritance tax. Marx's analysis of the evolution of capital in Europe makes little headway in observant Muslim societies, since there is no principle of primogeniture. An English duke's estate is inherited by the eldest son. The others have to make their way in the world as best they can. But the Muslim inheritance system divides an estate multiply. All children inherit, and often further relations as well. And a third has to go to others outside this family circle. Often this will be willed to awqaf of various types. So in Istanbul, for instance, a century ago, where a European city would be largely divided among aristocratic and banking families, a third of the Muslim city's land was owned by awqaf, whose revenues could only be used for charitable ends. That's the result of people making waqf and zakat donations for 500 years, a third of the city. Speaking of one type of charity, the Quran determines that recipients will be relations, orphans, paupers, and wayfarers, adding, so that this wealth should not be circulated among the wealthy amongst you. كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. Wealth is to be ploughed back into lower and disadvantaged segments of society: the homeless, the familyless, the refugee, the asylum seeker. These are all timeless categories of human need, which have a right, haqq, over the assets of the fortunate. The advantages of a tax on wealth rather than simply on income are not only set forth in the Quran. In the year 2014, a literary sensation ensued when the French economist Thomas Piketty published his book Capital in the 21st Century. Piketty's concern is with income disparity. He points out that when dividends on capital exceed the economic growth rate, the rich get richer. The solution is not an income tax and is not more VAT, but a tax on wealth. Piketty at times almost seems to be echoing classical Islamic thinking when he goes on to suggest that a shift away from income taxes to a wealth tax would not only reduce wealth differentials, but would energize the economy. Money left idle would be subject to an annual haircut, forcing asset holders to invest in profitable enterprises. These would in turn generate a higher revenue, since income taxes would be proportionately lower. Parasitical investment would be replaced by a more active investment strategy that focused on real asset growth rather than the circulation of funds among passive investment vehicles. The result, Piketty predicts, would be an end to our era of secular stagnation and the return of a more healthy economic model based on tax as a negative reinforcer. Passive assets would suffer while economic activity would be rewarded, with positive consequences for employment, investment, company dividends, and global trade. Piketty's thesis, sadly, is unlikely to be implemented. Even in the world's biggest economy, the United States, Donald Trump's suggestion for a national haircut, which would pay off the national debt in a single year, would, as the outraged critics note, precipitate massive capital flight into other asset classes and overseas markets, although this would in the American case be mitigated by the fact that America operates a global tax regime, taxing citizens wherever they and their assets are domiciled. Piketty's context is France, which actually has a wealth tax. Anyone in France with total assets over 1.3 million euros is subject to an annual levy of up to 1.5%. It's always nice to approach a right-wing French politician and praise the French state for the Islamic tax which it has always applied. But it's 1.5% if you have more than 1.3 million euros in France. However, the net result has been capital flight, particularly to London, now home to over 100,000 French tax exiles. This is the usual argument which people use against the idea of a wealth tax, but it does not apply to zakat, which is global and universal. A Muslim believer is obligated wherever his money, whether his money is sitting in the TSB or in some shell company in the Cayman Islands, it makes no difference at all. Let's remember a further interesting and sadly neglected fact. We tend to think of the zakat level as a flat rate of 2.5%. However, the Sharia raises this on certain asset classes, notably the category known as rikaz, essentially meaning wealth with no previous owner which exists underground. Here, although the madhahib diverge somewhat, we find generally that mineral wealth on extraction attracts a 10% or even 20% zakat charge. This is the zakat al-rikaz. In 2008, Al-Azhar's Institute of Islamic Research issued a fatwa about this. Oil wealth, like other mined mineral wealth, is to be considered rikaz, and hence the Mufti called on oil-rich Gulf states to pay a flat rate of 20% on all oil assets once these are removed from the ground. The revenues would be used to uplift the economies of poorer Muslim nations and to relieve the sufferings of the poor and refugees. It would not be right to say that this thought met with an ecstatic reception in the Gulf area. However, the higher rate zakat asset classes are there in the classical Sharia manuals. The timeless relevance of those texts is very conspicuously shown when we consider how enormous would be the impact of such an annual levy if applied virtuously and efficiently to relieve countries like Bangladesh and Mali, where a single dirham goes a very long way. The hoarding of assets instead in London property portfolios and the speculative purchase of modern art, football clubs and shares in Apple and Fox News would be dented, returning asset prices to something more recognisably normal. The global economy would benefit as the new import demand in the countries being developed by Rika's financing would support base industries and stimulate trade, particularly within the OIC countries. Note another interesting and neglected consequence of the Zakat al-Rikaz. It specifically targets mineral wealth, including fossil fuels. An effective hike of 20% in oil, coal and gas extraction costs would represent an effective subsidy in the same value to sustainable alternatives. There is no Zakat al-Rikaz on hydroelectric dams, wind farms and solar arrays. Where these are private instruments, they will be liable to the ordinary 2.5% zakat rate. A whole lot more could be said about this. Whether we like it or not, we live in interesting and also very precarious times. The future is hard to guess, and sensible experts have mostly stopped trying. Even the Donald may have to take a haircut. He could probably do with one. But it's reasonable to foretell the ongoing significance of London and the United Kingdom as a centre for global and Muslim wealth. As the nations of the Middle East implode, their elites are increasingly likely to move to our shores. This is an opportunity too good to miss. London is set to be the world capital of Muslim wealth and probably of Islamic banking as well. And now, with the National Zakat Foundation located right here, it is set fair to be a hub of authentic and transformative Islamic benevolence and wealth sharing. So let's all hope and pray for its continued thriving, wisdom and compliance with Sharia law. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Abdal Hakim, for a really a tour de force, I would say, on zakat, the global economy, and ending, I think, with an indication of the significance of the work that we are attempting to do and the vision that we are hoping to achieve, inshallah. I suppose I'm going to pass the baton on now to Shaykh Sohail Hanif, who's really going to, I suppose, given the context or the context that has just been set, to maybe hone in even closer into the actual workings of the National Zakat Foundation and try to give you an idea of the specific achievements, opportunities and challenges that we are encountering at the moment. To introduce Shaykh Sohail, Sohail Hanif graduated in 2000 with a bachelor's degree in Information Systems Engineering from Imperial College London, after which he spent over a decade in Jordan as a student and teacher of Arabic and Islamic studies. He was the head of Arabic Sciences at the Qasid Arabic Institute and taught online courses on Hadith, Tafsir and Islamic law at the Qibla Islamic Institute. He is currently a DPhil student in Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford, where his thesis studies legal change, fatwa and the construction of authority in Islamic, classical Islamic legal thought, focusing on the Central Asian Hanafi tradition. For the past 3 months, he has been the head of the National Zakat Foundation's newly formed Research and Development Initiative, about which he will tell us a little bit more. On a personal note, I actually first met Shaykh Sohail in 2005. So after having been inspired by Shaykh Abdal Hakim in my undergraduate years at Cambridge, and before starting at Lehman Brothers, which I actually conveniently left out of my introduction, I've spent 8 months abroad in Jordan, and Shaykh Sohail had the unfortunate experience of having me as a student of Arabic grammar and other such things, which I still have no real idea about. But that was definitely my fault and not his. So it really is a great pleasure again to introduce and to invite Shaykh Sohail to come and address us all, or take us on the next part of this journey this evening, and to talk about the power of zakat in transforming our community.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Many thanks to you all, and many thanks to Shaykh Abdal Hakim for a very powerful reminder of the modern world and the role that we have to play in it. I just wanted to share my own reflections and thoughts. As Iqbal mentioned, well, he didn't mention, but I was a long-distance fan and supporter of the National Zakat Foundation. And I always felt it was probably, or arguably, the most significant project that I could think of to be a game changer for the British Muslim community. And after having joined in the capacity of research and development, and after having been interviewing team members and documenting policies, sorry, I stutter on P words and T words, I'm only feel even more convinced and sure that this really is potentially the biggest game-changing project for the British Muslim community, and that we all have a role to play in seeing the implementation of zakat in our society and on our planet. What I wanted to do was share my reflections to build off of what Shaykh Abdal Hakim has said on the role of zakat in our community, but focusing on my experience with the National Zakat Foundation to give you a taste of what currently is happening. You know, after 5 years of experience and growth and self-reflection and working with the community, where are they at currently in terms of their ethos, their philosophy, and their practices? And on that, then where are the next steps that we are trying to take, and what steps are we taking to get there, and what role do we all have to play as a community to take us there? So in terms of the current state of the organization, there are 3 principal services which are being offered in education, collection, and distribution of zakat. In terms of education, there are training workshops up and down the country for people who want to learn about how to pay zakat. There are training workshops for zakat teachers to make sure that they have the necessary support, resources, and a community to help them in their task of training zakat payers across the country. There is a Q&A service where people with their own personal, complicated, difficult circumstances to write in or call in and speak to an expert who will talk through with them about the situation and help them figure out exactly what they must be doing to pay their zakat. But the most impressive thing for me, as someone who's been assessing this state of affairs recently, is not just the educational services, but it's the ethos on which these services are being offered, which is not one of what you'd imagine a charity organization saying, well, we need money for particular avenues that we're interested in, but rather that we're an institution whose goal is to serve this ideal of zakat, and we are here for you. So if you want to give zakat to your neighbor, to your relative, that's completely your choice, and you would know best where you think the zakat is needed. But by all means, we are here for you. You want to call in, you want to write in, you want to talk to someone. We want to hear your questions. We just want to make sure that you're paying your zakat. And the same with other organizations. If they have a zakat drive for a particular goal or a project which they're working towards, if they need help with training, they need help to make sure the material is accurate and correct, then the National Zakat Foundation is there to offer that service. So it's an educational drive purely for that sake, to uphold this pillar as much as is possible. And so it really is an institution for an ideal, as opposed to what you'd think of when you think of a charity organization. And I'm not saying this as an ideal in theory, but this really is the ethos of the team, and which I've been working with and interacting with. And I was alarmed because I like the organization to get all the money, but it's quite an impressive ethos, and it's going to lead to very, very big things from this team and from the project. The second service is collection, which obviously, if you have zakat funds, here's a place, a reliable place which will facilitate your payment of funds to be distributed on your behalf here in Great Britain. And that brings to the third service of distribution. And I want to dwell a little bit on this topic to give you a taster, again, of the ethos and the philosophy and the ideal that has been developed over these last 5 years on how these funds are distributed. Excuse me. The first thing I'll say when it comes to distribution is that the National Zakat Foundation follows a very strict, narrow definition of what a zakat recipient can be, namely that it is a Muslim, and B, someone who is poor, with the specific definition of someone whose net financial worth is less than about £200. Why am I calling this a very narrow and restricted understanding? Is that those of you who've had a reading in the Islamic, Islamic legal literature will know that no, there's quite a vast array of possibilities that zakat can be used for in the various discussions of the jurists, both past and contemporary. But the primary reason for this is that this is a national unifying communal project. And so this narrow definition that has been the underlying definition up until this date is to make sure that no one is left out, no one feels uncomfortable. Whatever opinion or school or your understanding of the Islamic legal tradition is, this is an understanding which you'll feel comfortable with and you'll feel comfortable being a part of. And so that's been the drive so far. But even within that, they've been working very closely with scholars to come up with innovative, creative ways to really meet the needs of the British Muslim community and to spend them for the greatest advantage on behalf of this community. And I want to give you a taster of what I'm talking about. It's that when applications come in, and the majority of zakat funds are distributed to individual grants, an individual applied saying, I have such and such a need for such and such a reason, this is my economic situation, can you please help me? The funds aren't hastily dashed out because you look like you're worthy and go on and take care of your life, but rather there's a caseworker who works very closely with applicants to try and get to the bottom of what really is the issue that led to this problem in this person's life, first of all. And secondly, is there a resolution? Is there a solution we can come to take you out of that problem? And if we can arrive at that, then the zakat funds are used to help someone out of their problem. For example, if a lady calls in saying, I'm homeless, can you give me some money? The caseworker will try and figure out why is she homeless? What led to her problem? And if it happened to be she fell out with her brother who kicked her out of their home, or she had a fight with her dad and ran away, then the caseworker's first call will be to ask, well, you know what, can I please get in touch with your family? Can I see how they're feeling? Will you guys be willing to do mediation? And if they can come to that, then the zakat fund will pay for that mediation as the zakat payment to this homeless lady, because that's most likely the best resolution of her particular problem. Or if the person needs counseling, or if the person, for example, if their income isn't enough to get by every single month, then the solution isn't always just to keep meeting that shortfall every single month, but it's to see, well, within your aptitude and interests, is there a training program that you can go on that will significantly impact your ability to earn? And if there is, then let's make that our goal, and let's make that our zakat payment to you. And so there's a whole load of cases that can be presented to show this ethos in practice, extreme care with cases to try and reach solutions and try and identify problems. In addition to this, the caseworkers try and make sure they're not duplicating other funds that the person has access to, unnecessarily spending zakat money where it's not actually needed. And so the case working team is made up of people with a variety of relevant backgrounds in immigration law, Citizens Advice Bureau, job centers, to really understand what funds do people have access to and what are the areas where there's no one to catch people, so that the fund can be there to catch them until they can stand on their own 2 feet. For example, a lady on a spouse visa who has to leave her home because of domestic violence. She has no immediate recourse to public funding. However, she's able to make an application for a domestic violence concession, and then funding will start looking after her. But who's going to catch her for the 2 weeks before that application is approved? Who will catch her for the month until those benefits start being paid to her? That's where the foundation comes in. It'll help her with the application, and it'll catch her when there's no one to catch her until she can continue on in this society. With cases where there aren't any clear resolutions, for example, a failed asylum seeker, oftentimes they're told, I'm really sorry, but you can't live respectably and decently in this country. And there's no particular solution that we can actually offer you here. And perhaps it's best for you to go back to your country. And if you need help settling, then we can come to an agreement. We can get back and try to search for a more respectable way of living. In terms of innovative ways to deal with zakat funds, again, within this very narrow definition of the poor Muslim, are a scholarship, a yearly scholarship that students can apply for if they meet this definition and they can show that they have an aptitude and to really excel in their studies. They can have a scholarship which will get them through their undergraduate degree, as long as they show each year that they are performing. Or, for example, a business startup. Someone is just struggling getting by, but they have an idea that maybe they can start an entrepreneurial project which can lift them out of their situation. If they can show they have experience, they have the know-how, they've done their homework, and it looks like a liable project, they can be given help in this area. So just to give you a taster again of the responsibility with which zakat funds are handled, to avoid duplication and to avoid pouring them into bottomless holes of situations which aren't actually being helped or improved. Part of these, sorry, 1 second. Part of these innovative initiatives are what Iqbal referred to, are these housing projects. 3 projects for homeless women, 1 for ex-offenders. It's an unfortunate stat, but 13% of prisoners in Britain are Muslim as of 2011. Who is there to catch them again? To make sure they don't go back into a cycle which they want to break out of. And so these housing projects, again, aren't just here's a home, here's some money, here's some food, now you take care of yourself. But everyone who goes into these has a key worker who trains them in simple, how to live, in a domestic household, run a household, how to apply for jobs, how to apply for education, and so on. Emotional counseling, spiritual counseling. So after 3 or 6 months, they're ready to go out and hopefully have a better chance at life than they did before they came in. And so this is again a taste of the method, the manner, the ethos, the responsibility with which these funds are handled. In addition to, again, a yearly audit by the leading charity auditing organization in the United Kingdom to make sure at the highest professional standards that every pound is accounted for what it was said to be spent on. And so as we can see, it's a quick look, and again, my point is just to show what I have seen. It's been quite a nice growth then in the last 5 years. It's been quite a welcome contribution to our community in this country. The question now is, where do we go from here? And that's again my capacity in research and development is to be part of these conversations. Where are we going to now? It's clear that the larger picture isn't simply to keep doing the minimum possible. The larger picture has to be doing the most possible, to do our best to understand what really is God's purpose in legislating this institution so we can fulfill His command. This is the ultimate goal. And it's clear that there is a big picture. To build on what Shaykh Abdal Hakim said, just looking at a legal textbook, which is again my own interest, it's clear that the rules of zakat are pointing to something. The legal textbooks all say it is disliked to take your zakat away from the community in which you are, except in particular cases. Why is that? It's clear that the zakat is building something. It's building communities. It's building within you, the zakat payer, a sense of identity and belonging to where you are, which, as you know, is a question of great concern to us in our particular context. The zakat is directly targeting this idea of belonging and responsibility and building something where you are. Why is it primarily paid to Muslims? Again, it is building something. It is building a faith community where you are. Why is that? In addition to strengthening bonds of faith, is the fact that this community is able then to fulfill its duties and its responsibilities in the best possible manner to itself and to all other societies and communities of which it is a part. And that's why, again, looking at the legal injunctions of zakat, you really see it is almost a bridge building exercise. Again, exercise is not the best word, but that's what it is doing. Why is that? Again, in the widest possible sense, if you look at the Quranic verse on zakat, one of the 8 categories is a group called al-mu'allafat qulubuhum, peoples whose hearts are to be won over, are to be reconciled. Some of our jurists say these are new Muslims, like that sad story that Iqbal told us about. A lady converts and there's no one there for her. The original Quranic injunction is that the community has a fund set aside specifically for such people, to welcome them into their new family and to let them start a respectable, decent life in their new family of faith. Some of our jurists say this is for non-Muslims, that the community sets funds aside just to spend charitably and to show displays of goodwill to the surrounding communities of faith. Why? To build bridges with them. That perhaps they'll find an avenue to their hearts to experience some of the serenity and the beauty, which is the remembrance of God Most High, which is at the heart of the Islamic faith and practice. And some of our jurists say that these people are those whose hearts, who are actively, vocally attacking Islam, that the community sets funds aside to spend, to show them signs of goodwill. Why? To maybe those walls that they've erected can be removed a bit, brick by brick, and maybe a new world and a new form of communities can be built by this. And so the rules of zakat are clearly building something. And we haven't fulfilled this purpose if we aren't directed towards such avenues of building and creating and sustaining and nourishing communities. And for this, the zakat, it has to be centralized. And that's, again, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, in the time of the early caliphs, it was a centralized affair. There were zakat collectors. And again, this comes again in the Quranic text. So that the funds can be used and set aside for the benefits of the community, as the Quranic text is indicating. Why is the zakat only 2.5%? People complain, oh, that's nothing. I give so much more charity as it is. Why? Obviously, I don't have to worry about this thing. It's like that for a purpose. It's 2.5% only of particular forms of wealth which you are seeking to grow. So in a service and trade economy, it's money and the things that are used as money. Why? Because it's kind of like a haircut. I had to bring this in. That you cut something off, but the thing you've lost, it is growing naturally in your own economic activities. Why is that? So that zakat is always easy to pay. It's never a burden. You never have to run away from it. But when you pool it together, it has great consequences. And so all I'm saying here is that the legal texts are clearly indicating a bigger picture, which we are all responsible for figuring out what exactly it is and what we can do together to get there, because we can't do it by ourselves. We can only do it together. What we're trying to do at the National Zakat Foundation is to figure out ways to bring together Islamic scholars, nationally and internationally, to discuss exactly these questions. What are the reconciled hearts, and how can they be dealt with in this British context? Another category within the Quranic text are freeing slaves, people who are enslaved, who are working, to buy their own freedom. They are zakat recipients within the Quranic text. Is there a context here? Is there an application here? Some would argue yes, because there are people brought to this country against their will who are unable to live respectable lives. Should the zakat funds be used to liberate such people from such forms of modern enslavement? It's not my place to answer that. I don't know the answer. All I can say is these are really serious questions. And the National Zakat Foundation provides the opportunity for us to answer these questions because something actually can be done about them. We're trying to figure out ways to bring together academics and practitioners to input into this process so careful, thought-out plans can be made for our way as a community going forward together. In terms of the short term, between now and then, what we're trying to do now at the National Zakat Foundation going forward is, in addition to just responding to people's applications for their needs, which we'll keep doing, is to think of proactive ways now to use the zakat funds so that people have access to important services they cannot afford. A first step we've taken in this direction is the relationship with the Cambridge Muslim College and with the Ibrahim College, two outstanding organizations which are producing the Muslim leaders of tomorrow, is that if they have students who are considered, again, poor and Muslim, with the definition I've given to you, who show that they can really excel and nothing is stopping them except for the finances, then to give them a scholarship so that they can experience, so that they can have this experience and be the leaders of tomorrow. And so we're looking now to see how different ways that we can literally invest in the human resources of our community. What are the areas where people have aptitudes and abilities to really transform not just themselves but their community, and what is stopping them? If there's a financial barrier, can we work to remove that barrier? And so these are some of the exciting avenues, again, going forward that we're working on. What kind of future, lastly, can we see? Again, you can all picture and imagine it. Shaykh Abdal Hakim already mentioned which didn't occur to me actually, was again all the foreign wealth that we have centered in our capital, and focusing just on the wealth of the people who are resident here. There's about 3 million or so Muslims of a few years ago. Pew estimates 5.5 in 2020. How many do you think there'll be in 2050? 20 million, 30 million? What percent would be zakat payers? 20%? What's the average that they're paying? 500? We're talking about very, very large sums of money, which if they can be channeled to be spent maturely and carefully and responsibly for the community, for the purposes of zakat, as I'm saying that the tradition is speaking of, I'm saying we can see a very different Britain. A Britain where the Muslim community has the upper hand. And I don't mean in a dominating sense, I mean in a giving sense. The Prophet said, the upper hand is better than the lower hand, i.e. giving is better than taking. A different Britain where we have a sense of community and giving and maturity and belonging, which ultimately is the only thing that we can use to achieve some of the things we often spend a lot of energy talking about influencing, the larger decisions of state and so on. So I'll just leave you with these ideas and thoughts. And yeah, it might sound like a great dream, but at the end of the day, it's something we have to work towards. There's no instruction in the Quran emphasized after the prayer as the zakat. And if the zakat in its biggest rules, whether it's the rikaz, again, which Shaykh Abdal Hakim reminded us of, which wasn't on my mind at all, which is really powerful, or whether it's the very simple management of the normal funds of your money and so on, there is a bigger picture here that the sacred law is calling to, and we are responsible before God to do our absolute best to meet that. And whatever challenges we find, to do our absolute best to meet them together, because zakat is something we can't do it alone. We can only do it together. And the National Zakat Foundation is giving an opportunity for us to come together to exactly achieve that. And as we do, we might realize that the real beneficiary of the injunctions of the sacred law of Islam are not God, but it's us. It's us and all those hearts that we might be able to touch and benefit and grant them a chance for a better future and a better life. Thank you very much for your time.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh Sohail, for doing what's usually my job, but I'm so glad that there's somebody to do it way better than I could ever do. So, see, one of the privileges of getting to a 5-year stage is that you're not doing everything. Because in year 1, trust me, you literally are running around like a headless chicken. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has really blessed me with, as I said at the beginning, amazing team members. And many of whom are dotted around the room. They are keeping themselves quite discreet, but they're basically one of these sort of badges on with a logo. So if you see any of them, just harass them or do whatever you have to do. Time's moving on. I did want to give a quick opportunity for any questions. There's a lot has been said, and really a lot to take in. And I'm really glad actually that this event, through the speeches of our two esteemed speakers, has encapsulated really what I wanted to sort of bring out at this event, which is really some sort of historical context, current kind of context in which we're living in, as well as the significant opportunities of the National Zakat Foundation going forward. That we're not just a social welfare charity, as maybe we've been conceived, just an alternative to any of the other charities that may be handling zakat funds, but an institution that really is at the heart of fulfilling our potential and achieving really, hopefully, what is best for us in this life and the next. But a lot has been said, as I said. I just wanted to give the opportunity for any questions. So I think the question is really about balance in giving, because it's obviously something that we've been encountering a lot in terms of the local, international, and how should we think about those things within zakat, or think about zakat as local and sadaqah as international?
It is difficult, and different people have different forms of calculating it. Part of the issue, I suppose, is that the idea of what's local is not really the same as it was, say, 500 or 1,000 years ago when fiqh compendia were created. Like yesterday, I prayed Maghrib in Switzerland, and the day before I prayed it in Austria, and the day before in Germany. So we're all mobile now. So when it comes to something that's specifically to do with in your own locality, which is quite a strong emphasis in the classical fiqh texts, what does that mean in the context of globalization? When I can press a button and immediately it's transferred to Palestine or somewhere. There's a legitimate question there. But it is also the case that there is much need and increasing need here amongst British Muslims, and historically most British Muslim charities have focused on sending remittances overseas and neglecting the sometimes very extreme cases of need which happen right here in Europe and in England. In Cambridge, for instance, we're getting our first Syrian refugee families. Are the Muslims helping them? There's one guy who's a Bedouin. He's kind of from the desert, and now he's in the rain in Cambridge and doesn't know what's hit him. Do we have support for those people while the paperwork is processed or not? And as population movements become more intense, I think that the justification for acting locally, where after all you can keep an eye on what's going on much more easily than you can if you just make a credit card donation to somebody who's working in some earthquake zone far away, and you don't really have that assurance about where the money is going. I think that the local is going to be more significant, and more so. 2 days ago I was visiting some people in Austria near the German border, and they said, 20,000 Syrians just walked past going over the German border, and really destitute people without papers or anything, just not knowing where they were going, except they didn't know what Austria was. They knew there was a place called Germany, and they could get across the particular point on the river. So those are certainly legitimate recipients for zakat. The problems are coming home here. We don't need to travel to find them. But I'd be interested to know if there's a specific policy that the National Zakat Foundation has. Do you have allocations for overseas relief or charities working?
It's really interesting you mentioned that, actually, because just yesterday we were discussing this with a couple of our trustees. I mean, right up until now, we have a very strict UK-only focus, and I think it was in the context of what you said. I think we decided to retain that focus simply because, everybody else had a focus everywhere else. But it is something that I suppose we've started to think about and discuss, that maybe in the future we may not just become a zakat institutional collecting body simply for local only, but maybe just a zakat collecting body full stop, and then try to make some informed decisions about what the best balance is between local and international. But right now, I think just to redress the overall mismatch that there is, that's what we're focusing on.
I mentioned that topic of the non-Muslim within the topic of doing our best to understand what is the bigger picture that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us to work towards in terms of institutionalizing the collection and distribution of zakat. That was one of those top topics, one of those questions that need to be investigated. Currently, the National Zakat Foundation, like I said to you, only pays to Muslims who are poor in the two definitions that I have given to you. The classical jurists have their own debates about this category, whether it stands, to whom it would apply, and so on. And so these are questions we are keen to engage with. But to do that, we really are trying our best to bring together a large number of scholars to really figure out what is the most responsible way to move forward with these questions. But as of yet, there are no payments set aside for this purpose.
I do want to say, actually, just in the context of that, though, that when we do receive, sometimes we have received a couple of things, actually. Number one is when we have received referrals or applications from non-Muslims, we have done our best to either try to support them with non-zakat funds where relevant, or at least to make sure that we can refer them on to the network of charities and support services that we now have access to. Another quite significant point which I wanted to add to, just to add to what Shaykh Sohail mentioned, is that around half, I hope I'm not misrepresenting this, but around half of our referrals come for Muslims, but from outside of, if you like, Muslim community infrastructure. So we get regular referrals, believe it or not, from police stations, hospitals. We've even had referrals from social services. Everyone thinks that why does NZF need to exist, because these guys exist, but actually something started to happen sometimes in reverse. And we get a number of referrals from the likes of Red Cross, Women's Aid, Refugee Council, Refugee Action. So we have very good, Women's Aid, actually I mentioned, I think, because it's a significant one where we get very regular referrals, as well as our own mosque and community infrastructure. So East London Mosque in London, for example, Regent's Park Mosque are regularly sending referrals to us. To the tune, about now, we're getting approximately 150 new applications each month, and every day there will be at least 2 to 5 kind of emergency cases that need dealing with today. So when an application comes in, we also almost have like a hospital, kind of triage system, where you have the stuff that needs handling today, the stuff that needs maybe handling within a week, and maybe the others which perhaps take a little longer or can wait. Just a significant point to mention, and I think that that's been really powerful in terms of having that mutual relationship with some of those charities whose hands are typically tied from providing the actual support that's needed. So take a charity like Refugee Action or Refugee Council, for example. A lot of these things are very local authority funded, and that local authority funding comes with very specific criteria about what that charity can and can't do for that beneficiary. So we've had applications sometimes from a charity like that for a refugee for whom they found funding for a course that they need to go on as part of their development or whatever, but they haven't got the funding for the travel to the course, right? So within the red tape of how they operate, that's just not there. So then they'll maybe apply to us for that, because obviously when you're on £35 a month, as an asylum seeker is, travel to and from a course just a few times a week is going to break your budget. So I think that bridge building sort of analogy is really, I think it's clear from this example how that often is the case. That I know this seems like an odd reference in the context of what has been a rather deep evening, but I do often think about that scene from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, when he comes to the end of one sort of side of a cliff, and he needs to get to the other end. I mean, if you've seen it, as I saw it in my teenage years, you know what I'm talking about. And it's quite, because it is really probably the best Hollywood representation of tawakkul, actually, if you look at it from that perspective. I can't believe I had the guts to say that in Shaykh Abdal Hakim's presence. But anyway, but literally, he comes to the end of one side of that bridge. He hopes and prays, and he lifts his foot, and he puts his foot down, and then it starts paving over. But it literally is like that, because when they're in that state of desperation, they're at that edge. And really, the way I sort of envision it is that with that zakat, we're just paving that way, I suppose. And it still, it means that they also need to walk, and they need to walk. And in the vast majority of cases that we deal with, people, there's a great kind of, they have a lot of dignity, so they don't want to be in that position. They don't want to be in that position where they're so desperate. And sometimes it takes a lot for them, to have made that application or be referred to us. Whereas often our stereotype is completely the opposite. So especially when that is the case, then I, for one, feel, even more determined to make sure that when they are there, that we are there to pave that road for them. Because if not, and I always just picture standing there on the last day thinking, or being asked, well, where were you for so-and-so, and for so-and-so, and for so-and-so? And what will our answer be? For me, I hope, and for all of us, I hope the National Zakat Foundation will be part of that answer, to say that we tried, and we tried to implement this institution, this pillar, so that we could see dignity, and we could see hope, and we could see an absence of the kinds of destitution and tragedy that we do encounter every day. So with that, I'd like to really thank all of you for being here today, for supporting, and I really hope that you've taken from this evening the inspiration to be a lifelong supporter, advisor, volunteer, even staff member one day for the National Zakat Foundation, and just to really take that message to others as well. People ask me often, they come up after an event like this, and they'll say, what can I do? How can I get involved, etc., etc. And it's really difficult to manage sometimes, to be honest. And this is the confessions of a charity chief executive, right? It's really difficult to manage, because sometimes when you've got no systems and no structures, and people are kind of, they want to get involved, then for us to always manage that, it's quite difficult. And sometimes, to be honest, sometimes we may put people off because they sent an email, and in the 5,000 emails and unread emails that I've got since I started, their email's probably hidden in there somewhere. But you can do a lot just by taking the initiative. And I think that, first thing I always say, because it's a really easy thing to say, is that just look at your phone book. If there's anyone in your phone book that doesn't know about us and what we represent, then make sure they all know. And when that first task is done, come back, and then we'll move on to the next stage. Because it's really significant. This room now of 120, 130 people can literally, by this Ramadan, have another 10,000 people knowing about us simply by sending out messages, emails, WhatsApp, and all the rest of it. So please do take that on board. And a couple of final points. Shaykh Sohail mentioned our services for Zakat payers. We have over here just a small table where you can pick up a Zakat guide. I think in your bags there may be some material as well. If you'd like to make a donation or a Zakat payment, because you just can't wait for Ramadan and you need to do some of it now to purify yourself and your wealth and all the rest of it, then we've got a facility to do so over there on the laptop over there. Some other housekeeping points. If you haven't registered for the event, you came in late or what have you, then please do that too, because then we can have your information so that we can keep in touch with you. Dinner is inshallah going to be served now, shortly. There's a buffet set up outside, so you guys chose your seats really well. And I think it's 8:40 now, so I think just to give time for dinner, we'll pray Maghrib at 9:15, so precisely at 9:15, if you can just be ready to pray Maghrib at 9:15. We'll try and clear up some space in this room so that we can all pray together for those who are around. Toilets are just outside, and what else do I need to say? I think that's it. Final message, just to thank all of you. Jazakallah khair for being here. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for bringing us here together. And actually, one last set of people who I have forgot to thank earlier, but I definitely saved the best for last. Both my parents are here today, and it's not often that they've, I think, both been together at a National Zakat Foundation event. And I just want to say to them, or make a dua, رَبِّ اغْفِرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيَّ وَرَبِّ ارْحَمْهُمَا كَمَا رَبَّيَانِي صَغِيرًا, because everything I do is really comes down to you. So I hope it all weighs on your scales one day very heavily. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.